right-wing, left-wing freak show back to Vermont, where it belongs. Now, there's surely a kind of demographic inconsistency there. You have this picture of Marilyn Manson sitting on his porch in Rutland, reading Maureen Dowd and laughing so loud that he chokes on his unagi. And in fact, demographically, this simply isn't the case. I ran into an article in American Demographics not long ago where it pointed out that the majority of brie purchasers in America are Republicans, which isn't surprising considering the neighborhoods in which brie is sold. Nonetheless, that campaign, that effort in branding the liberal label, has changed the way in which everyone uses the word. When you do a search in the press, and even in the so-called liberal press, that is to say, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, and you look at the way people use the phrases middle-class liberal, middle-class Democrat, middle-class Republican, middle-class conservative, they're used in about the same proportions. When you then search on working-class liberal, that phrase almost doesn't exist. It's only working-class Democrat. Similarly, black liberal, African-American liberal, Latino liberal, and so forth. Those phrases like conservative, working-class conservative, black conservative, Latino conservative are fairly common. In fact, they're a good deal more common than phrases like working-class liberal. To believe that distribution, you would have to assume that liberals are a category restricted to the upper middle, like the white upper middle class. And that, as I say, is a picture that's present in That's why a large number of Americans are very uncomfortable about calling themselves. When you look at the polls and the positions people take on the issues, they tend to break out in about even numbers. When you ask them what they call themselves, people who describe themselves as conservatives outnumber people who describe themselves as liberals by about 50. A similar word that's also been given to people as liberal areas. But back in the 1950s, leftist was a word that denoted something that began where left began. And leftist was a very serious charge to make back in the told McCarthy to stop using the term leftist because it would discredit the Republican Party. The word became less frequent over ensuing decades, and then over the last 5 or 7 years, it's popped enormously, particularly in domestic conflicts. It's used now, though, for just about anyone who it's become almost a synonym for liberal. Not just Senator Kerry's called a leftist, or Senator Kennedy, but Republicans like Harlan Specter and J.P. On the web, Susan Sarandon or Martin Sheen are about 3 times as likely to describe a leftist as Fidel Castro. And Jerry Falwell applied the word Dixie Chicks. I mean, I love the Dixie Chicks, but it's hard to think of a hearing a band that this one's over the shoulders and pretty rough. But what that does is to blur the line between liberalism and leftism in its various forms. And again, an effort to brand liberalism as being outside of the political mainstream. In fact, you sometimes see those terms reversed now. An article in the Florida paper a couple months ago described the academy as full of extremely liberal leftists. I saw that, I thought it was a fun to have thought that it's like formulation of extremely leftist. Let me mention a second strategy to accomplish the same effect, hiding among the means of the words. What I think of the phenomenon of legacy means, the British politician Ira Devon once noted that the student of politics must always be on his guard against old words because the words persist when the reality behind them has changed. It's a very common strategy in marketing accompanied by once lustrous brand names like KitchenAid or Longshore have attached them to new downscale products and some of the lustrous will carry over. And it's also very pervasive. The term special interest is the term has changed enormously. And in particular, it's been a strategy that the right has used to great success in appropriating and neutralizing the language of liberalism, of the civil rights movement, and of the 60s movements. That's really what compassionate conservatism comes down to in the end, is being able to use language in new ways. Words like colorblind, for example, were once exclusive property of the left, now have moved to the right. When you listen, for example, to Newt Gingrich talking about a basketball game in the Chicago Jazz, this is the example for our society to follow. Gingrich said, a group of individuals so focused on a common goal of winning that they don't have to worry about what color the other guy is as the ball guy. Now, what's interesting about that is it is in fact the very rhetoric you would have heard in what were called the problem films of the 50s. I don't care whether the guy's black or white or polka dot. I just care whether he's simply talking. But now that rhetoric is being introduced, not in the service of civil rights legislation, but rather in opposition to affirmative action. Empowerment, another word that begins on the left, works its way to the right. Inclusiveness, Bush talking not long ago about Senator Sanders equating homosexuality with bestiality, described him as a very inclusive man. President Bush asked Congress to pass a faith-based initiative program so that, I'm quoting, people of faith can know that the law will never discriminate against them again. Now, you could, in fact, argue that the Constitution does, in fact, discriminate against establishment religion. But nobody would have ever thought to put the word, using the word discrimination before recently when, again, that word was appropriated to describe policies very different from what hate speech to those of us who remember when the word first came in the 1980s refers to hateful speech directed at someone on the basis of his or her gender, sexual preference, national origin, ethnicity, race, and so on. Ed Gillespie, the Republican National Chairman, has been very successful at using this word to refer to speech that expresses what's considered hateful of President Bush. So, Representative Gephardt's description of Bush as a miserable failure is branded as hate speech by Gillespie and the Republican National Committee. Again, using the word in a new sense, but trying to retain the old valence in the same way in which municipals try to get KitchenAid is high-end kitchen product. So, let me give a third example, and then maybe I'll close. Political rhetoric doesn't just make itself known in these potent words like special interest and discrimination and bias and so on. The big words, obviously, a lot of the but you can also hear it in the syntactic patterns and the little words and functions that orient our thinking. An example in a piece that Becky wrote. When you listen to right-wing talk radio, you notice that the speakers, both the hosts and the callers, often begin their utterances with C, as in, C, Kerry isn't actually going to say the war was a mistake. C, the Democrats don't want you to know this. When you listen to left-wing radio, there is a lot of them out here. Listen to KPFC radio. You hear the same sentence produced, but with the introductory particle, look, Kerry isn't going to say that the war was actually a mistake. What's the difference between those? Well, C is a way of cluing someone into something, letting them in on the certain. Look is a way of appealing to shared assumptions. Those two words, as small as they are, imply very different ideas about the nature of the conversation that's going on over these media. And different ideas, in fact, about what the media talk radio was all about. Another point that makes that same point, and there's a piece in this book about this, if you listen to Rush Limbaugh, one of the striking things, and this isn't true just of him, but of many right-wing radio shows, and also a number of shock jobs, he addresses his audience in the floor. It's always, I'll tell you what, folks, or you ditto heads out there, or some of you out there may say. Now that form of address suggests the presence of an audience, not just a listenership, that has the effect of creating an us and a them, and it turns radio into a crowd phenomenon, like a concert. where one naturally subjects one's individual judgments to a sense of solidarity with the group. It's not very frequent on TV, except on Fox. You'll hear Bill O'Reilly every once in a while using that. O'Reilly's the few guys that made me the poster boy for the American dream. But usually what we hear on network TV is the singular. You know, up next, protecting yourself from internet scams. Or should the tires on your car have an expiration date, not your car? And that's the standard of address in traditional reporting and, in fact, in traditional fictional writing. Charlotte Bronte doesn't begin the last chapter of Jane Eyre by saying, "Readers, I married you." So he changed the tone of the word. What this language shows, and again the writing is very adept, is an appreciation of how language can be tailored, or has to be tailored to the meaning. And the great master of this was Ronald Reagan. I did a video of mine extraordinary to understand how to coordinate his language with the media. It really changed the form of presidential communication. If you listen, for example, to the last presidential debate of Reagan and Carter, the candidates were asked to make their summary remarks. Carter began his statement by referring to the vote in the third person. The American people are facing next Tuesday a lonely situation. Reagan understood that the real audience of the debate wasn't the reporters, but the audience at home. He began his statement, next Tuesday all of you will go to the polls, understanding that. And then he went on to ask the famous question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? In a similar way, he refashioned the statement. He would say, don't let anyone tell you that Americans as states are behind you. Clearly, that view would refer to these legislators and attendees, but to the civilian audience. He had an intuitive understanding of how to use the language in a way that was appropriate to the meeting. Now, his style was often described and it's certainly true that he used normal language in a very strategic way. Certainly no president before he ever begun a sentence of an inaugural address as well. But what he used was really a very stylized language that simulated the intimacy of conversation without really partaking of it. There's a phrase he uses a lot, and yes. If you look into speeches collected at the Reagan Library, it occurs more than 200 times in his speeches, as in the ability, dedication, and yes, patriotism of you who are her crew. Or the ideas, the muscle, the moral courage, and yes, the spiritual strength that has built the greatest, freest nation that the world has ever known. It's a very useful device for suggesting a speaker who isn't ashamed to own up to his patriotism or sentimentality or to stand on simple principle. And of course, it's an implicit rebuke to those who consider such avowal of patriotism important. But this isn't a device that, it's not a conversational device, not something you say at your breakfast table. Pass me the cream and yes, another bagel, right? It's rather part of this very artful, stylized register. Another device is what I think was called polysyllabic registers, the piling on of conjunctions. Here's a sentence again from Reagan. We've come to Hamilton just as we went to Elizabeth and Hoboken and Doylestown and Buffalo and Edmonton and Waterbury, because you're what America is all about. Here in Wyoming, back where your farmers and ranchers and workers and small business people dream big and toil hard to make dreams come true. Let me briefly read sections of a piece I wrote on this device before Reagan's death, but a piece about Peggy Noonan, who was Reagan's speechwriter, and no doubt had played a big role in getting those phrases. This is called the politics of politics. The stylistic differences between the left and right aren't just a question of the words they use, but the tunes they sing with. Take a piece by Wall Street Journal's Peggy Noonan on the resurgence of patriotism, or as she calls it, the simple idea of the goodness of loving America. The nation that won the war in Iraq had nothing to do with the victory of the success. In was, I quote, a bigger America and a realer one, a healthy and vibrant place full of religious feeling and cultural energy and Bible study and garage bands and sports love and mom love and sophistication and normality. And. That repetition of conjunctions is what rhetoricians call polysynthetone. It does a lot of work for Newman here. Each of those ands implies an and not, in opposition to those urban cosmopolitans who don't have religious feeling, don't study the Bible, don't love their moms, and don't have garage bands, most likely because they don't have garage bands. They're the people Noonan describes as the intellectuals, academics, and leftist mandarins, not to mention the local clever people who talk too loudly at restaurants. They would be. Then, too, the ands flatten the differences among those unlike things, replace the conjunctions with commas, and all of a sudden the thought emerges in all its vacuous and coherence. A place full of religious feeling, cultural energy, Bible study, garage bands, sports love, mom love, sophistication, and morality. Noonan's prose often did it to that rhythm. It was daring and brilliant and brave. You want to really feel it and experience it, smell it and touch it, and thank God for it. But then a lot of columnists use this device, particularly the ones on the right. David Horowitz says they hate you because you were democratic, intolerant, and unbelieving. David Brooks says America doesn't seem as much trash as strong and indomitable. Jack Kemp, Bob Dole has unfurled our banner of growth and opportunity and hope and cultural renewal. It's as if most of the American right was often a retreat on the day when the rest of the freshman nation was covering the serial column. Michelle Malkin writes in a letter to American soldiers, "You hail from Middletown and Middleborough and Greenville and Reading and Thousand Oaks and Maple Street and South Central Bronx," she might have added. I suspect it's another one of the garage bands. It's true that you don't hear this rhythm from some conservatives like William F. Buckley or George Will or William Safire, writers who are like Gushin. There are writers on the left who are guilty of it, like the tirelessly expensive Molly Hyde. But even so, the pattern turns out to be about 5 times as common in the right-wing press as in the left-wing press. It isn't as if this pattern has an inherently political meaning. It's in the Bible. It's in Shakespeare. Whitman, of course, uses it all the time. Bob Dylan uses it, and I'll tell it and think it's reflection of the But the pattern has a particular cadence in American writing, where it signals plenitude and immediacy, as if you're laying down your thoughts one sentence after another. It bubbles up whenever people are lacking about dogs, baseball, or the English language, particularly about the English language. And it's a staple of eulogies and, of course, book blurb, where it's often compounded by alliteration. Wise and winsome and witty and warm. Ultimately, this is another one of the things that along with all the writers. But it's not likely that Peggy Noonan picked this up from written, much less from Allen Ginsberg or Gary Snyder, who responds to that. If you listen to Noonan's sentences, you hear another, even more familiar voice. Just remember this, Mr. Potter, with this rabble you're talking about, they do most of the working and paying and living and dying. Well, is it too much to have them work and pay and live and die in a couple of decent rooms in the bath? The money's not here. Your money's in Joe's house, right next to yours, and in the Kennedy house, and Mrs. Macklin's house, and 100 others. It's all there in Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life. It's the pattern that playwrights and screenwriters of the 30s and 40s used when they wanted to evoke the artless wisdom of the common man. You think of the scene in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, where James Stewart says, "Get up, I can imagine something. Get up there with that lady that's on top of this Capitol dome, that lady that stands for liberty. Take a look at this country through her eyes if you really want to see it. There's no place out there for graft or greed or lies or compromise. That's what Noonan and the others are aiming for this pattern. The rhythm of the simple feelings that are obvious to everybody but the clever people who make life easy. But the device is apt to sound a bit calculated and self-conscious when you run into it in the Wall Street Journal, particularly in an age as going as ours is. Back in Capra's time, people didn't make it a point of pride to be in touch with their feelings or to dwell on the simplicity of their ideas. At the end of her piece, Noonan says, "Is this corny? Too bad." Well, no. Capra was corny, and so were writers like Robert Riskin and Nunnally Johnson and Joe Swirling and Sidney Buckman and Clifford Odets and Robert Sherwood even if they were clever and lived in big cities and didn't go to Bible study classes and talk too loudly and dressed. But what Noonan does isn't corny, it's kitsch. Let me leave you with a cautionary tale. This book is, that I've tried to communicate, about the business of trying to be attentive to what language is saying. And I'm still long doing this thing yet. I always find myself falling down at the job. I did a piece in the Times, Weekend Review, a couple of months ago, on the language we use for old people. And I was talking about these new slang words like jerrys and tweezers and frogs and so on, not to mention these original words like crinkly and crumpet, which sounds like a law firm out of big time. And all the euphemisms like golden age or third age and so on. And I talked about these. Newsletter dealing with the problems of age in America. And he said, look, I loved the piece, but there was one sentence I was unhappy about. But some people have worried that the connotations of the word boomer might become more derogatory as people over 65 come to constitute a quarter of the population, increasing the economic burden of Social Security. He said, why did you use burden? Would you have used burden of the economic burden that makes the economic burden of primary education? Absolutely right. In the middle of a piece written about the way in which certain attitudes toward age are implicit in the language, which I then submitted through the whole careful process of 4 times editing. This word has sailed right through the opening line until he brought it to my attention. And it reminded me of what the linguist, the late Dwight Mollins, once said about the problem of singularity. It's like building a fire in a stove. Nonetheless, I think it's something we have to try. Thank you very much. Now, how can we get any questions?
Hey, look at that dead weight.
Yes, thank you. How do you do this? What technology do you use to...
I'll repeat the question for you.
what technology...
You killed him.
What technology do I use to do the word counseling? Boy, that word so tough. There are enormous numbers of databases available from press databases like Nexus. We have all of the New York Times and all of the Journal of First days of publication. We have huge collections of 19 basic novels, so depending on what you're interested in, you can usually find doing counts that give you information that would have had a judgment. Would only been able to get what judgment was about once upon a time. It also is an extraordinary way of scooping the OED. Look at the OED, which was based on a couple of million citations in all for all the words in English language. It's very often the case, particularly in recent books, that their first citation of a word will be 10 or 15 or even 1,500 years later than it's actually time. I did a piece on protest. This was next to the rights protest, pro-war protest. And I was interested in when protest marches the OED banned the bomb from the Committee on Disarmament in the UK. Look in the journals and newspapers. We saw, in fact, the protest march was being used back in 1912 to describe the march where Gandhi organized in Natal in South Africa. So the short answer is that the technology has completely changed the way in which
I'm not quite sure how to phrase this question, but please correct me if I'm wrong. I think I heard you basically say that Republicans have done more of a bigger job of manipulating the language in terms of politics than Democrats had. I'm curious as to why is that? How has that come to be the case? Why haven't the Democrats done? Is it just that, is it coincidence, strategic cleverness, better linguists in Republicans? Why or how is that? What does that really say?
I think it's a very good question. The question is, why is it that Republicans have been more, I would say, successful or adept at using the language in these ways than Democrats have, at least over the last 20 years? Now, I think there are several answers. One is that Republicans have been able to coordinate a very concerted campaign of using the language. During the Gingrich years, for example, there were lists of phrases that Republicans have been elected, and that sort of thing, that Democrats have. The pollster Frank Luntz, who's been very influential in Republicans, has enabled them to clean up the way they talk. Unfortunately, to clean up the way they talk about the environment. So you don't hear phrases like rollback or deregulation in regard to the environment anymore. Luntz has told them, well, let's talk about common sense solutions or innovative solutions, and that's the wording you use. Democrats have also had various deficiencies of their own. There's a tendency, talking about mainstream Democrats, to wonkiness. If you look at a lot of the phrases that form crucial elements for the liberal Democratic program, like single-payer plan health, it's a phrase that means almost nothing to someone to whom it hasn't been explained. Now, I think Democrats are being more skillful in all of these primary challenges. For one thing, a point I didn't discuss here, the Republicans have taken over pretty much the language of values in America. In fact, the word values itself, if you do a search against three liberal papers, you find that the phrase conservative values is anywhere from 4 to 5 times as frequent as the phrase liberal values in domestic political context, as if to say that really conservatives have that. Democrats in this last primary system have been very strong at using the word values and using the word morality and using that language and trying to recapture that language. The language of patriotism as well. Kerry has been deliberately trying to use the language of patriotism. So it may be that this balance can be redressed, but it also has a lot to do with the way the media cover this. That's another thing. Yeah. I should call on the next
and as an advisor to the American Heritage Dictionary, how do you feel about balancing the traditional, quote-unquote, correct use of certain words as opposed to the new usage?
You know, it very much depends on the individual case. I did write the user's notes for the American Heritage 3rd edition. It had a lot to do with it, with the fourth edition that came out a couple of years ago. And it's not easy. Sometimes you'll have to balance several different kinds of different considerations. We'll look and see how the word is used in the press. We'll ask our usage panelists, about 175,000 writers. I'll give my own opinion. And sometimes they will not agree with those three things. And I think that the business of a dictionary is not to tell you this is correct and this is not correct, but rather to say, well, here are the arguments, here's how the word's used, here's what educated speakers say about it, here's how it's used in the press. So, and it goes very much on a word to word basis. Back to you.
I've heard it said that you cannot have a private language, and I wonder if in America you're going to left and right, and I thought you talked as well there. But if you look at human history and human civilization going back hundreds of years, one might say that the Democrats and the Republicans, possibly the Republicans have been moving far right, and the Democrats are centre right, who haven't got a left. But if you look at the consequences of both parties in terms of the prison population, the respective teachers, even in California, the richest place on earth, probably, you wonder what these words mean.
The question is, what could these words mean given the way conditions are in America? What could these words left and right mean? And I can only give you a linguist's answer and say that it's an interesting linguistic situation and an interesting topography that we've mapped out. No other nation on earth makes this twofold distinction, left and right, liberal and conservative. That uses both pairs of terms. And no other nation defines them quite as Americans have. And that's something that really only took shape during the Roosevelt years. Before 1932, this way of thinking about the political landscape really wasn't all the same. So it's very difficult, for example, for French or Italian or German newspapers to describe when they want to talk about liberals. In France, if they say liberals, they'll mean European liberals, which is a very different thing, or even in the UK. They'll say the center left, or they'll say, but locating the American political spectrum on that European scale is very difficult, and that's why it's particularly difficult to talk about the center of gravity moving one way or the other. Over here.
In a sense of who I'm against. I sense that politicians are now parsing their sentences so they are exactly correct, but totally misleading. How does one talk about that style of a speech? I don't want to say he's lying, whichever, but I want to say that statement is absolutely bad. What's a linguistic way?
I don't know that there's a linguistic way of doing this. If you think about the tendency to use this cautious speech, euphemism, circumlocution, whatever, in a certain sense it's the tribute that we pay to veracity. You know, there was a time when people used to simply lie, and now they're much more careful about it. And I think a lot of the changes in political language, whether the way it's used or the form it's taken, or the way we perceive it, have a lot to do with the fact that so much more of it is covered, and covered by broadcast media in real time, rather than being covered in the press. And so politicians, and this is true of politicians on both sides, have got to be much more careful about what they say on the knowledge, as we saw recently many times, that a casual remark, if what happens to be wearing a live mic in a hotel, can suddenly be a matter to be bandied about on CNN and Fox News. It's also, I think, the reason why we perceive the political debate, one of the reasons, as being so much more vituperative than it used to be. In fact, there's a history of contumely and division and vituperativeness in American political debate that goes back to the time of Jefferson and Jackson and so forth. But the main difference now is you can turn on the radio and you can hear this 24/7. Let me have vituperation to the left, you push button 1. Let me have vituperation to the right, you push button 2. It's all around us in real time. That really has changed, I think, our perception of the nature of things. Over there.
One of the difficulties that brings us about life is the fact that we don't acknowledge, as Thomas Kuhn so aptly does, we tend to operate by paradigms, each of us. And we don't acknowledge initially our initial presuppositions or paradigms, if you will, which brings your point. It's become more vituperative because of the fact that we're living in an age, like Alice says, of the balkanization of the United States, where we don't talk to each other. We shout past each other. So what's the remedy?
The question is, isn't it the case that we live in a world of paradigms? These words are connected to basic differences in worldview. I think that's the point. So that we're talking past each other rather than with each other, shouting past each other. And I think it's a very good point. One of the difficulties, in fact, about writing about political language in the way in which I've done it in the book, I've tried to do, is that these words don't exist. They're not isolates. they come, a word like bias or discrimination comes trailing behind in a whole, what linguists sometimes call a frame. And George Lakoff has written very interestingly about the way in which these frames work in political argumentation, political language. It trails this whole apparatus behind it, and you have to understand that. Another example, and I think makes the point very dramatically, is the word freedom. Freedom is a very interesting word. It's only in the last century that it's become the dominant American political virtue. The First World War, for instance, was fought not in the name of freedom, but in the name of liberty. And it was liberty ships and liberty bonds and liberty drives and so on and so forth. Freedom really was a word that began to become the dominant political virtue. Only Roosevelt, when he spoke of the four freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear, two notions that couldn't be expressed as liberty. And freedom expanded still further during the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King and so on and so forth. For many people, freedom, that word still has all the evocations of Roosevelt and King and Roosevelt. It was Reagan, again very skillfully, who saw the effect that freedom had, and where previous conservatives had been using liberty. Senator Taft talked about his opposition to right to work laws under the name of liberty and employment. Reagan was smart enough to take freedom over the bookings for Chicago at that time. 15 to 1 or something, that the number of cases of freedom and liberty. For him it meant free markets and individualism and so forth. And that's what it means today for conservatives, certainly, to determine it that way. So when you talk about freedom, it can evoke either of these two different traditions, which naturally overlap in the middle. Hopefully there's some commonality to our political discourse, but can mean very different things to different things.
I'd like you to comment on Bush and other Republicans very grim and hurling, one or two insults put down most effectively toward Democrats. So what I'd like to know is why are the Democrats so timid about using language in an interesting and effective way? I think they're afraid to play, and I'd like to know why.
The question is, why are the Republicans seem to be so skillful at throwing these brief one or two word insults at the Democrats? Why haven't the Democrats been able to respond? Here again, I think if you look at the rhetoric of the Democratic primaries at Dean and Gephardt and others in the Democratic primaries, they were quite skillful. I mean, miserable failure, sort of says it all, if that's your point of view. And I think they have been. I think Kerry's style is particularly, he's uncomfortable with that sort of thing, and that's particularly him. But I don't think it's a characteristic of Democrats in general. And I think Democrats in general are coming out of that wonky tendency to over-explain. Now, it's true that there are basic differences in approach. I was reading Kerry's speech on Iraq a while ago, and he begins his sentence by saying, as complicated as Iraq is, and I said, well, that isn't a sentence that President Bush is as complicated as Iraq is. But I think that the Democrats in general have begun to realize the importance of using simple, accessible, powerful language to make that point. And so I think this will redress itself. I think we have time for one more question. We'll get back.
W refer to our president quite prejudicial.
Your thoughts about the use of W refer to our president? W. Presidents have had affectionate nicknames, and I think that began his life as an affectionate nickname, although it's qualified for that. But I don't have strong feelings. But I also don't have particularly strong feelings about Bush's difficulty with the English language. I mean, for a linguist, it's easy to make fun of that. It sounds like you learn the language of that self. But those are pretty venial errors, and lots of people who run very important organizations very skillfully make similar errors. I think there are other things of which Bush in particular is but they're on the order of, I'm making a distinction, they're on the order of fingers, not typos. So perhaps we could stop with that. Thank you very much.
Jeffrey Nunberg is a regular language commentator on NPR's Fresh Air. Going Nuclear is published by...
We're leaving now, but we'll be back.
Okay, thanks. Well, I'd like to discuss some questions about a topic that goes back to classical antiquity, remains quite obscure in many ways, and has many significant implications, I think, which I'll try to bring out, at least indicate. The question is, what is the fundamental nature of language? What's it for? What is it designed for? There's a simple classical formula goes back to Aristotle that language is a sound with meaning. That raises three questions at once. What is sound? What is meaning? And what is wit? The most neglected and most crucial question. There's been a good deal of discussion of sound in over the past several millennia, as good as known. A lot of consideration of questions of meaning and how much is understood, but a good debate. But virtually nothing about wit.
I've had enough sitting around. Let's roll.
Simply by association. So a child sees a cow and somebody says cow, and association is set on between that thing over there and the word, and how that spins the meaning. So that doesn't survive much examination. But clearly to touch the real question, we touch the fact that the number of associations of that kind of uniform associations is unbounded. So it can't be set up by experience. So that's the problem. It's very rarely been noticed in the whole history of thinking about language. Occasionally it has. Galileo was maybe the first to point out the obvious fact that the language our language capacity has infinite scope. The alphabet, the greatest invention that enables us with 25 letters to express any thought that might come to our minds. Notice that he's not accepting Aristotle's dictum exactly, but that's a description of language. It's sound. It's not quite the same as sound with meaning. It is an interesting word. This is picked up not long after by Descartes. And in fact, for Descartes, it's the foundation, one of the foundations of his dualistic science. Ancient and long story, also much of the history of philosophy, but crucial. After that kind of language comes up again in the 20th century. Because the concept accordance with the development of the theories of capability toward Gödel and many others. The notion of finite characterization of an infinite class became pretty well understood. That makes it possible to ask ourselves what would be the nature of the sound meaning relationship, whatever it is. Well, the basic something internal to us, mostly our brains, which means it's effectively, it passes effectively an organ
Running
design
some alerts. Let's move.
rather than sensitive organ, which is eventually in biology some subsystem of the organism that has enough internal integrity so it can be studied on its own and interacts with other such modules, systems, subsystems that may be functioning in the life of the organism. So that should be more controversial. Hopefully it isn't, but controversies aside. Well, we learned that there's a concept of sound, which we now externalization of life. The outside modality
Well done, my boy.
visual sign.
Losing ground, people.
Are interested in working on that. Go on with some internal analytic capacities that's common to any form of
You're a dangerous
that would suggest to us that maybe our cells get confused further with the cell layers population that maybe exists on sound, but some part of its cells
Dig into the base. We're almost
the
there.
sound is just the simplicity of any form of externalization. It turns out this distinction between whether languages sound is making with sound where they come the way it's sometimes called the central function of language. In fact, the notion in a minute. This traditional